Order. We now begin public proceedings. Can I welcome members and witnesses to our evidence session today on the curriculum and assessment review. Before I ask our witnesses to introduce yourselves to us, can I invite members to put on record any interest that you would like to declare today? Serena.
Thank you, Chair. So previously I have had paid memberships with the NASUWT and more recently ASCL.
Anybody else? No. In which case, can I invite our witnesses to introduce yourselves to us today, starting with Jill Duffy.
Hi, good afternoon everyone. I'm Jill Duffy. I'm the Chief Executive of OCR, one of the three main exam boards in England. So we offer GCSEs, A-levels and vocational qualifications, and we're part of Cambridge University Press and Assessment.
Hi, I'm Tim Oates. I'm Group Director of Assessment Research and Development at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. I do a great deal of international comparative work and do a lot of four-nation studies looking at education, and I chaired the National Curriculum Review in 2010, resulting in the new curriculum in 2014.
Good afternoon, I'm Deputy Director of Policy at ASCL. My name is Tom Middlehurst. I lead on curriculum assessment, school systems, SEND, and contributed to the review.
Good afternoon, my name is Darren Northcott. I'm the National Official for Education at the NASUWT.
Thank you very much. I'll begin our questioning this afternoon. And my first question is for Tim Oates. As the chair of the last National Curriculum Review, how does the current review differ from the work that you undertook? And why do we need another curriculum and assessment review now?
Thank you. Well, nations need to keep their national curriculum under review. There are various reasons why a national curriculum can date. We can find out more about learning, we can find out that there are issues, pent-up problems in the system, and certain subjects age faster than others. So there are differing rationales for changing the curriculum, but it's right to keep it under review. In some ways, it doesn't differ at all from the review in 2010. Its focus is on equity and attainment and ensuring that we have a national curriculum that supports high-quality curriculum development in schools. It does differ in a number of respects in terms of its focus. So it is also looking at qualifications and assessment, and the 2010 review was focused principally on the content of the national curriculum. The interim report is interesting. The masthead objective is evolution, not revolution, and the interim report acknowledges that the 2010-2014 curriculum and allied measures like the numeracy and mathematics and literacy initiatives raised attainment, and that increase in attainment was detectable in transnational surveys.
Thank you. And as we think about what makes for a successful curriculum and assessment framework, quite often attention is given to national and international indicators, the different kind of measurements of how students fare under the assessment regime. So I want to ask how reliable those measurements are as measures of absolute change in knowledge and skills in the school population over time.
Yeah, we've worked with the organisations that provide these big international surveys for a very, very long period of time. I've worked particularly with OECD, which provides the PISA survey, which is a cross-sectional study of 15-year-olds. There's also TIMS, which looks at grade 4 and grade 8, and there's PULS that looks at literacy in primary phase. They're pretty good. I mean, they really are meticulously prepared. They do focus on slightly different things in each case, but I think what is most important in terms of the data that we collect as a nation on attainment through our national assessments and our national qualifications, there's a very high correlation between high attainment in our measures that we use within our system and the outcomes of the big transnational surveys. The transnational surveys do also collect quite interesting contextual evidence and information on classroom climate, background variables in relationship to kids in terms of what they have at home and their home environment. And in some cases within the OECD surveys, they go more deeply than we do in terms of our regular data collection on children. But I think we can be assured that whilst there are grounds to constantly critique the big transnational surveys, there's a very, very strong relationship between what we detect in terms of equity and attainment and what they detect.
Any other witnesses like to come in on that point? In which case I will broaden out just to ask all of you how important curriculum is in influencing educational improvement and outcomes relative to other factors that also have a bearing on how students do during their time at school. Jill, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, there are a lot of other factors that will lead to increases in attainment. For example, teachers, making sure we've got enough specialist teachers, making sure they're properly trained. But the curriculum plays an incredibly important part in increasing attainment. It's important that curriculum is relevant and engaging to all students. It's really important that students look at themselves in the curriculum and see that they belong there. And also it's really important that curriculum isn't too overcrowded. So it gives the space for teachers to be able to develop the deeper understanding and skills within young people.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I completely agree with Jill. I think it's important the committee note that the curriculum, whatever the national curriculum is, will ultimately be influenced by the assessment system at the end of that key stage. So whether that's key stage 2 SATs tests or whether that's GCSEs or A-levels, that is going to be what defines essentially what the curriculum looks like. And that in itself is influenced by the accountability measures that are put in place. So in terms of your question about how important the curriculum is in defining what schools do, yes, it's absolutely crucial. But in terms of practice, actually, assessment and accountability probably come before. And then I put a fourth issue on there, which Jill alluded to, which is the recruitment and retention of teachers. We could have the best curriculum in the world, but if we don't have teachers that can teach it, then quite frankly, there's no point in spending all this money on reviewing the curriculum. So yes, curriculum review is really important, but it's probably, I would say, on that list about fourth, because actually in terms of the mechanisms and the vehicles that the government has to influence what schools do, assessment, accountability, recruitment and retention of teachers probably have a greater influence than actually what is on that piece of paper or on that PDF in terms of the national curriculum.
A greater influence on the outcomes for children? Yes, I think, and Tim will know this better than me, but I think there is really good evidence that the biggest influence on the outcomes for young people are the teachers in the classroom, not the curriculum that's in front of you. But Tim, you will know this better than me from an international point of view. Let's come in on that.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I'll come.
I think it's really important to recognise that, and this may sound quite controversial, the national curriculum isn't a curriculum. I mean, it's a list of outcomes. So, explain the properties of matter according to the particulate theory. That's the kind of statement that you will find in the national curriculum. It's a goal, it's an aim, it's an objective. It doesn't tell you how to teach. It doesn't tell you how long you should spend on it. Those are real curriculum matters. So that's why in the literature that we've created on the national curriculum and understanding the place of a national curriculum in a set of policy instruments in a nation, We contrast the national curriculum and the school curriculum. The national curriculum is a relatively succinct statement of a set of goals. That needs to then be turned into a specific curriculum in a specific setting for particular groups of children. It's not that it's unimportant, you just have to understand its status. Of course it's important. What's in there, decisions about what should be in there and what is excluded, does condition things. But of itself, it has that status. It is a list of goals. It is not a curriculum in the sense the school curriculum is a lived, enacted process which children experience.
Sorry, Darren, did you want to?
I was just going to say, I think that's a very important point. The curriculum is important, Tom's right, but it sits within a particular context. There are things that influence that curriculum. I'd agree entirely on the point around accountability. And also Tim's point about the fact you can have a curriculum, but teachers and leaders have to turn that into lived experiences for children and young people in school. So that's a process in and of itself, but it is extremely important, and the curriculum and assessment review is critical because that's the basis upon which schools will then decide what those learning experiences look like.
Yeah.
Thank you. And sorry, Tom, did you want to come in with a follow-up?
No, Darren likes that point. So, yeah.
Okay.
I think one of the things that I would like to emphasise to the committee is that there's a lot of discussion, for example, of issues of curriculum overload. That's been a big discussion around the need for review. But very often the comments around overload relate to qualifications, not to the national curriculum. You know, these are important distinctions. Mm-hmm. Be very clear about which policy instrument we are talking or engaging with and its technical characteristics. The best way of putting it, I think, is that if you have a terrible national curriculum full of the wrong things, it will be very damaging to your education system. But if you have the right national curriculum full of the right things, it doesn't necessarily follow that that's what will be enacted in the classroom. There are many other factors, accountability, assessment, inspection, targets and so on, which will determine the priorities and the objectives of teachers and managers in particular educational settings.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll start with Tom and then maybe widen the question out. So the ASCL has called for a clearer vision from the government on the purpose of school education. Do you think other goals should be set than those relating to qualifications? So, for example, well-being or communication skills, employability skills, health and happiness?
So, I think there is an oft-quoted quote that people use to say we measure what we value and we value what we measure. I slightly disagree with that. I think there are some things in education that are really valuable that should be in the national curriculum, that should be as part of the infrastructure of the curriculum, that actually we shouldn't value, we can't value, and if we try to value, would actually be at the detriment of teaching those things. So in terms of that kind of broader picture of what should that look like, I think that means that we shouldn't try to achieve a point where everything that we think is important in education is in some way measured. I don't think we can measure everything. However, that being said, I think we have to look really, really carefully at the way in which our accountability system encourages schools to act in certain ways. And that might mean that they are only teaching things that are on the test. And that's wrong. And we know that. And that is not because school leaders are acting with any bad faith. It is because they are worried about that high-stakes accountability system. So I think when we're talking about curriculum assessment, which is what this committee is talking about today, we can't disassociate that from accountability. So in terms of what that means for measurement, I think we could have a really intelligent accountability system that looks at what it's like to be in this school. does it foster certain values that we think are important as a society? Do we need to try and put a number on that? Absolutely not, and we're very clear about that. We can have a narrative report that talks about what it's like to be in that school, what the values of that school is, and how they implement those values in a meaningful way. So yes, we think accountability should go beyond what we currently have. Do we think it can be measured in the same way? Probably not, and actually could be quite damaging if we try to do that.
The question wasn't entirely about accountability. It's about what's the purpose of education. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to produce 16-year-olds who are healthy, happy, confident, ready to go move on in the world and go on and be employed and have successful, contented lives? Or is the whole purpose of education just to get them through those GCSEs? I mean, and that comes down to, are you saying that because of our accountability measures, that is what it has been reduced to? Because we can't measure more nebulous things?
I think for a lot of schools that was how they will feel. I think there is a difference in your question between what is the purpose of education and what is the purpose of schools. And I think that we need to be really clear about that. Given the current financial pressures that schools are under, and the fact that financial pressure is going to get more acute over the coming year, I think we have to be really, really clear about what we expect schools to be able to do within that climate. So clearly, I think everyone around the table would agree that education is more about qualifications and should be about children thriving and being able to find their element and doing what they really care about. Are schools able to provide that in themselves? Absolutely, in an ideal world they all would, and I'm sure no one, I'm a former teacher, no one would go into education feeling that they don't want to do that. However, we have to be very clear about what the expectation of schools is, and so I think yes, absolutely, education more broadly should be exactly as you said about children thriving. Is that possible in the current system? It's becoming increasingly difficult to do that.
Oates, I think you wanted to come in on
Thank you.
this question.
Yeah, so just a reference to law and also a mention of what is done to survey and what should be done to certificate, and I'll clarify what I mean by this. So UNESCO does undertake periodic survey of well-being of young people and across different nations, and England does not do well on those league tables. So we take that as a reference point. Then just let's think about the law. The current aims of education that are enshrined in law refer to the physical, intellectual, spiritual and social physical development of young children. Those aims have been in place since the 1944 Act, and they're still a requirement in law of all state-funded schools. And that's a nice broad set of aims, actually. I mean, of course, there's huge contestation about how you deliver them, but they're there as a legal framework, and it's nicely broad. It relates to specific outcomes in the form of subject attainment in subject disciplines, and it refers to the kind of general goods of education that educationalists hold dear in terms of the sense of agency that young people have and so on. And I'll finish on certification assessment. Now, we can, and we do, survey in the same way in which UNESCO does. We can survey schools, or we can decide at what level we survey, to see how kids are doing in general by sampling individuals. That's not assessing every child, but it gives us a sense of how things are going in our education system. If we sample at another level, we can tell how it's going on in particular types of schools and so on. an implication of what you said is should we be assessing each and every child? And if we assess them, what do we do with the information we get from those assessments? It shouldn't automatically be an assumption that we should certificate it. Issue some form of record at a particular age. So there are all these different options in terms of assessing children for their well-being. But it's all in the context of, I think, some quite coherently laid down overall goals, which are still to be enacted in law. They are still a requirement.
Anybody else want to come in on?
Yeah, I'll come in. I think no one on this committee would disagree with you, Caroline, that we do want to be creating happy children who are ready to go out there and progress in their lives. That's absolutely what everyone as an educationalist would want. And there are many factors, as you would know, that are impacting children's well-being today, including things like social media, anxiety about climate change, etc. I think if we sort of hone it down then to what can we do within the education system, what can we do within the curriculum and assessment, there are some things that we can do. As I said before, it's important we have a curriculum that everyone thinks can see themselves in, that they find engaging and motivating. And I think we have reached a point actually with assessment, and you may think this is something quite unusual for a head of an exam board to say, where I think we have got too much assessment, too many exams going on at 16. And we think we can do something about that. We think we can reduce, if you look at England at the moment, on average, a student is taking 30 hours of exams. That is far more than almost every other country. And I think the research that we've done has shown that we could reduce that level of assessment without impacting on reliability or impacting on standards. A concrete thing you could do at GCSE would be to say that each GCSE could have a maximum of 2 papers. A lot of them have 3 at the moment, and those 2 papers could be a maximum of 90 minutes. If you did that, you would reduce the exam burden on average by about 8 to 10 hours, and you could do that without reducing the reliability of exams. So that's a concrete thing you could do in the assessment system that could have a positive impact on well-being. But as we all know, there are a multitude of factors that impact young people's well-beings today.
And just to add to that, in terms of the well-being, the mental health of children and young people, there are provisions that apply to schools in that respect around RSHE, for example. So those learning experiences give children the ability to develop skills and explore issues that do relate to their health and well-being. But I think I'll go back to what I think Tom was driving at, which is if we start to codify these things very strictly in a curriculum that's set within a high stakes accountability context, and then we try and measure them in rather crude ways, I'm not sure that would encourage everyone to provide the kind of opportunities that children and young people would want. But the aim of education being, as Tim says, that it's been set out since 1944, to develop that spiritual and moral dimension of children's education is very important, and it's something that schools take extremely seriously.
Briefly, if that's okay, so we can move on to the questions.
I think it's also very important to think about the issues of welfare whilst children are at school. That's the sort of direct thrust of the question. But it's also very important to think about long-term progression and progression into the labour market and participation in society. And there we see very strong links between attainment in things that are quite traditional and good life outcomes in terms of health, employment, and social dimensions of family life. So I think there are some analyses which kind of counterpoint and oppose academic attainment and well-being in terms of outcomes, but actually progression is facilitated by attainment. The two things are closely entwined.
Thank you. That's helpful. Serena.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to build on your points that you made earlier regarding the breadth and depth of the curriculum and the knowledge-rich approach. What affects is the adoption of the knowledge-rich approach or content-heavy approach made on schools in primary education and secondary education. So we'll start with Darren, if that's okay.
I think one of the key messages from our members, and this might be different from the kind of knowledge versus skills debate that's kind of characterised discussions around the curriculum for the past decade or so, but I think our members certainly report a sense that the curriculum is overcrowded. Now that can be through over-specification, or it can be, as the Curriculum and Assessment Review kind of quite interestingly identified, through under-specification. So teachers aren't sure what they should try and cover, so they try and cover everything. But a sense of trying to fit too much into too small a space, I think is very real and is something that teachers and leaders report very frequently. Now, that's one of the things that the Curriculum and Assessment Review rightly has been tasked with considering. Is there too much content? Is there too much demand and too much pressure to cover too much? Does that create pressures on schools? What sort of learning experiences does it result in for children and young people? That's a really important point, but certainly there is a real sense that needs to be addressed, I would say, that the curriculum, as it's experienced and as it's delivered, maybe as it's specified, Tom's point about exam specifications being really important as well in this, there's too much to try and cover in too short a period of time. And that, I think, leads to some potentially difficult questions around what the curriculum includes and what it excludes in order to make it more manageable, but also to make it more broad and balanced.
Would you say that's both primary and secondary?
Certainly something you hear very strongly from the secondary sector, but I also think it's true, we hear that from our primary members as well, that the curriculum is very difficult to navigate, it's unwieldy. A useful exercise could be to look at that curriculum and see how it could be made more manageable. But we also need, I think, to be careful that the solution isn't just taking the curriculum we've got and chopping bits out of it here and there. I think it requires something a bit more fundamental. The Curriculum and Assessment Review is probably right that evolution, not revolution, is probably the best place to start. But those debates and those concerns, I think, do raise really interesting questions around what our curriculum looks like, how manageable is it, how broad and balanced is it, how does it contribute to children's engagement with learning. All of those, I think, are live and relevant questions.
Thank you, Darren. Tom?
Thank you. I agree with everything Darren said. I think this committee will often have people advocating for something that should be in the curriculum that isn't already, and they'll say, why isn't this taught? You know, why are we not showing adolescence, for example? And I think the question that this committee could really helpfully ask is, okay, well, if you're not, so if you want that to be included, what are you taking out? And we always have to ask that question. And I think when we come to Professor Francis's review in the autumn, we really need to be clear. If there are things that we think should be put into the curriculum, what are we taking out? Because as Tim has already said, the curriculum is already overcrowded. So we always have to ask that question. And I think that would be a really helpful role of this committee, to continually to ask that question. If you want something in, what are you taking out?
My question was more specific about the knowledge-rich approach as opposed to the skills approach. How do you feel about that?
I'll answer very briefly, but I think Tim wants to come in on that. I think it's a non-debate. I think you can't instill skills, say problem solving or collaboration or critical thinking, without doing that in a disciplinary way. So we have to teach that disciplinary knowledge. Now, what I do think is, with the Curriculum and Assessment Review, we have an opportunity to think about how we present that in a different way to schools and teachers. So if we can instill those sorts of skills that you're talking about, let's demonstrate that in the national curriculum. Let's not have a single PDF document that sets out just what we need to do. Let's say, here's a really interesting way in which you can talk about problem solving within the maths curriculum while still teaching mathematical knowledge as well. So I think there is a real opportunity here to not produce the national curriculum as a single document, but to do something much more interesting that would end this, what I would describe, and with no disrespect, quite a boring debate about knowledge versus skills. Finally, we can do something really interesting about that.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. So you associated two things, knowledge-rich and content-heavy. I think just to separate those for a second. So Reynolds and Farrell's work, Worlds Apart, way back in the late 80s, brilliant study of high-performing systems around the world. And we used that work as a keystone of the 2010-2014 review, because that identified that the highest performing systems tend to have fewer things in greater depth in primary. This is really important, the overall shape of the curriculum. They tend to have less pace, less content, coverage so that all children can access these difficult ideas and therefore be really well prepared for lower and upper secondary. That's a characteristic of high performing systems. We largely delivered that, I think, in the 2014 curriculum, but certainly not exclusively. There are some areas of overload in the primary curriculum, and it's right that should be reviewed. A knowledge-rich approach doesn't necessarily result in content-heavy. You have to exercise good decisions about what's in and what isn't. A knowledge-rich approach, for example, would say that it's important to introduce ideas around density into primary school, so that children they've experienced some learning experiences which enable them to get their heads around the idea of density, a very difficult scientific principle, as preparation for much more intensive study in secondary. Have we got the balance right between primary and secondary? No, and it's right that the current review should look at that. In terms of knowledge-rich, what's the direction of travel around the world? Well, quite a few countries which were committed to competence-based curricula and implemented them pretty rigorously over the last 2 decades, and now have noticed that their standards have declined and not increased, and are now looking at implementing knowledge-rich approaches. That's New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Poland, Sweden, and Scotland now, interestingly. The First Minister has put in place a committee to look at the role of knowledge in the Scottish national curriculum. And but they're doing that in the light of things like the overall shape should be fewer things in greater depth, in order to have preparedness amongst all kids of whatever attainment level in a much more intensive secondary period.
Thank you. And Jill?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with Becky Francis's view here that the knowledge-rich curriculum has meant that we've risen in international standards, which is a positive thing. But I think it is a bit of a false binary, if you like, to pitch knowledge against skills. You absolutely need both. I mean, skills without any knowledge is just vacuous. You can't do it. So it is perfectly possible for an education system to deliver both, and that's absolutely what we should be aiming for.
Okay, so would you agree with Francis's assessment of what is working well in the current curriculum and assessment system, the architecture of key stages, the national assessments and qualifications, the breadth and the depth? Where do you sit in terms of agreeing with those fundamentals currently being appropriate? So Jill, we'll start with you from an exam board point of view.
I mean, I think the interim report was right to say that the current curriculum and assessment system is successful, and it performs well when we compare it with other jurisdictions, other countries. So I would definitely agree to that. But I think, the key point we need to look at now is, well, what does need to change? Mm-hmm. So although, the curriculum and assessment system is working well for a lot of students, we know that there are too few that it's suitable for. So we have a lot of students, 30% of students, I'm sure Tom will come on to say this as well, that aren't getting a good pass, i.e. a grade 4 in maths and English. There are far too many students who are still being left behind by that system. So I think I agree with her analysis. I think the point now is, well, what are the priorities that we need to focus on, and what the second part of the review needs to focus on. And I think that's around maths, it's around English, and it's around reducing the intensity and volume of exams at 16.
Thank you, Jill. Tim?
I think I'm going to again introduce this distinction between the national curriculum and the school curriculum. Is our national curriculum, the list of goals, dramatically out of sync with the curricula of high-performing systems? No, it's not. Does that mean it should be left entirely alone? No. I've already hinted that there are some issues in certain subjects, both in terms of some dated content and some overload, which need to be attended to. But in terms of international benchmarking, is our national curriculum out of sync with high-performing systems now? And I think it's very important to attend to the surveys that the Curriculum Assessment Review has undertaken, particularly with parents. We've got quite reassuring data, actually, in terms of whether parents agreeing with, or strongly agreeing with, the extent to which their children were able to take the subjects they wanted to. This is reassuring stuff, and it's important to look at those data coming up from communities and parents. The sting, though, is in the tail of the equity data, which is something that Becky is particularly concerned with because of her research background. The big transnational surveys look at within-school differences and between-school differences in attainment. So for the same equivalent children, are the same outcomes being achieved in different parts of the school and in different schools around the country? And there we do not do so well at all. And that is where the equity problems really begin to arise. And we saw those amplified in COVID and COVID legacy. So I think using benchmarking, we've got a job to do with the national curriculum, but it's not dramatically out of sync. We've got a massive job to do in supporting schools in getting their school curricula to give access to actually deliver attainment to all.
Thank you. Tom?
Thanks, Ray. I'll pick on Jill's point around that third of young people that don't get a grade 4 at the end of secondary school in English and maths. We call them the forgotten third at ASCL. At the moment, the policy is that you have to just continue to put them in for those qualifications that they've already failed. The pass rates of those are really quite shocking. From this September, all sixth forms or colleges will have to put those students in for 100 hours of English or maths if they haven't got that grade 4. And that's regardless if they've missed out on that grade 4 by a single mark or if they've got a grade 1. Now, quite frankly, if they've got a grade 1, we probably think they probably do need 100 hours of maths. That probably seems quite sensible. Should they be studying for the same qualification they've already failed? Probably not. So in terms of the immediate things that we agree with from Professor Francis' review, English and maths absolutely has to be the priority. While I'm talking about this, and we might come on to this later, I think it's worth saying that we are very clear at ASCL that has to be a universal assessment. The idea of introducing a new qualification that students who didn't get the grade 4, age 16, at the end of secondary school, doing a separate qualification, I think automatically means that qualification would not be valued, would not be accepted by employers. It has to be something that we say all young people do. Now, the last government, which has been continued by the current government, have an expectation that 90% of young people will achieve what we call the expected standard in English and maths by the end of primary school. I think it is entirely acceptable and entirely appropriate that we expect the same 90% to achieve an expected standard by the end of secondary school. Otherwise, we are saying, as a society, we accept that 20% drop off through secondary school. That seems very, very odd. So I think the idea of an assessment, which we expect 90% of young people to achieve, is appropriate. Of course, not 90% of primary school leavers are achieving that at the moment, but it is, I think, an appropriate ambition. I think the other area where we would want to not disagree, but just to raise concerns about the interim report is there are some areas of the curriculum, particularly post-16, aside from that reset policy, which really, really need urgent attention. And the main one is the defunding of applied general qualifications, typically called BTECs. We cannot wait until Becky publishes her review in the middle of the autumn term for that decision to be made. Schools and colleges and sixth forms will be doing their open evenings in the autumn term, and last year they found it very, very challenging not knowing which qualifications they were able to offer the following September. We cannot be in that position again this September. We simply have to know, and that is not something we can wait until the review reports on to have an answer to. I think the government has to make a decision on whether we are offering applied general qualifications, alternative academic qualifications, what that combination looks like, whether you can offer a combination of them. Sorry.
Encourage a little more brevity in the answers, just so that we can get through all of the topics that we want to cover this morning.
But I think that is an absolutely urgent point of the curriculum that needs to be assessed before the review.
Thank you. And Darren?
Agree entirely on the point about AGQs. Just in terms of the curriculum and assessment review, I think a couple of things that I think it's worth focusing on in terms of the positives of that review was that it's very clear, and I think we touched on this point earlier, that you can't break the connection between the curriculum you want children to experience and the recruitment and retention crisis that we have currently in our schools and colleges. That's a massive issue, and that has to be addressed. Also, I think the review rightly picks up the extreme workload pressures under which teachers and leaders are working currently. That has to inform how you take forward reform. It doesn't mean that we can't be bold if we need to be bold, but we need to make sure that we are giving schools and colleges the support that they need. Just a couple of things, maybe they're not criticisms, but they're just further questions for the review. This goes back to your point about the knowledge-rich approach and what that means and how that's translated in practice, because I think your question was, I think, correct in the sense that that led to the kind of subject overload that we've seen. So maybe it's about the interpretation of what we mean by a knowledge-rich curriculum. We can talk about knowledge-rich curriculum, but what do you mean about skills? I think teachers and leaders tend to talk, if they have a concern in that area, about application, so about the way in which education supports the application of knowledge and understanding. That, again, I think the review kind of picks that up, so that's a really, I think, very key point. And just this point also about equity in the system, and obviously we need to think about how we define that. But clearly the review is right to recognise that we do have a significant issue in terms of the education experience of all children and young people. We know that too often it's determined by socioeconomic circumstances, by class, by poverty, by race, and also still by gender. So addressing those things have got to be at the heart of the reforms that we need to take forward. It's a really difficult task in the current context, but I think we need to think very hard about how we promote equity through the curriculum.
Thank you. Jess? Following on from that issue, when Michael Gove introduced his curriculum reforms under the coalition government, he said the core knowledge required in each subject would benefit the poorest students the most. But over the last 2 decades, the attainment gap affecting disadvantaged children has remained unchanged. Why is this? And what improvements can the review realistically achieve in addressing this long-standing issue? And I'll come to Tim first.
Thank you. So the data show, actually, it's interesting. On average, you're right. But the data show the gap was closing prior to COVID. There's very, very good research done by EPI, David Law's foundation. And with the gap declining, and then suddenly it began to open up a bit just before COVID. So it can't all be attributed to COVID. There was something that was occurring, and we've seen COVID really drive a coach and horses through what we were trying to achieve educationally. I think one of the things which I just want to pick up and link to this from the previous discussion, it's very important to look at the scripts of the kids doing maths and English and achieving grades below grade 4. At 16, they are failing to demonstrate attainment in the things that should have been achieved in the last couple of years of primary school. Now, this is really quite important in terms of the system having failed to detect that this is occurring, and also to look at the kind of provision which best suits those children. There's a lot of space between 11 and 16 to do something to address these gaps. There's not a universal relationship between disadvantage and low attainment, and there are schools which buck the trend. And this is to do with this between-school variation I'm describing. If you look at schools like Chesterton Community College in Cambridge, very mixed intake, top quintile of value added, and they have some very distinctive curriculum practices. Very deprived schools in Wigan worked with closely with primary schools in that area, and we were able to introduce new practices which again dramatically changed the attainment profile and the well-being of children. So we've got a problem in our system, a big system, a diverse system of between-school variation. And in a post-COVID world, we've seen an extraordinary opening up of these gaps and these regional differences, and we desperately need to attend to them.
Okay, thank you, Jill.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, I mean, we see it every year with exams since COVID. You know, exams, what the exams show, and they really highlight, they put up a mirror, if you like, to what's happening in the education system. And they show that there is regional differences and also differences between different socio-economic groups. So that's definitely there, and it's a problem that as an education system we need to solve. I think, you know, following up what Tim said, looking at what we can do to reduce some of the content, if you like, in the subjects that are particularly overloaded at GCSE, which includes maths, to make sure that we're focusing on, you know, the really fundamental math skills that are needed for life and work. As Tim said, we look at scripts every year and we see that if you don't get a grade 4, what you don't have are those fundamental math skills that actually you should have picked up at Key Stage 3, if not even primary. So what we have sort of proposed as a way forward with that is introducing a GCSE short course that would be done in year 10. You would still do your full GCSE, all children would do that, but it would be very much focusing on the fundamental maths skills that you need for life and work, and it could be recognised by employers in the way that a grade 4 in GCSE is recognised at the moment. And we think spreading out that assessment a bit more and really focusing on those fundamental skills will help those children, you know, the third of children who aren't getting a good pass in maths at the moment. And I think, you know, Tim mentioned it, there's a long gap between 11 to 16 where there isn't any assessment at the moment. So looking at some opportunities to spread the assessment so that it isn't concentrated in just a few weeks at age 16 would also help that, because that could help diagnose some of the issues that children are facing so that those can be addressed before they take their GCSEs at 16.
Yeah. Or Darren?
Well, I'll give my time to Tim because we've thought very hard about the ongoing impact of COVID and what that means for disadvantage, and we commissioned Tim to write a report on that. So I'll give my time to Tim to talk about that.
Well,
that's okay, Chair.
Yeah, I mean the COVID impact is still in the press, and we've Teacher Tap today reporting this current cohort going into GCSE as being particularly acutely affected. My own concerns are actually for those who were born and very young in pandemic, and primary schools are having to tackle extraordinary problems of not only cognitive problems that these children face, but depressed language, depressed socialisation, anxiety at being in public in school contexts, anxiety at being in large groups of young people, and so on. And you know, if we think of those are entering primary school now, this is a problem that will go up through the education system and be with us for a long time. There is some reassurance of young people coming through now into primary, from reception into primary, who were born post-pandemic, that there's been some restoration of the kind of social processes that we usually associate with being a very, very small child. But undoubtedly this problem, marching up through the system, with the years affected differently, and therefore presenting school with a marching set of problems, is a very, very significant one, being faced by many, many schools, both primary and secondary, and is not really been recognised fully in the policy process.
And can the curriculum review currently realistically address any of this? Or are these things that have to be addressed outside of a curriculum review process? I guess that was the question.
Well, I think that the review won't be in the changes. If you think of the timeline for the implementation of the changes, these cohorts are walking through education now. They need attention right now, and they need access to the content of the curriculum. And these other collateral problems which they face of socialisation, depressed language and so on, is actually presenting real challenges in accessing the curriculum.
Thank you. Darren.
I think your question is really interesting in terms of the very, very grand claims that were made for the changes in the curriculum that the coalition government introduced. And if you opposed them, and I remember at the time, you were castigated as an enemy of promise. And obviously I think experience teaches us that it's a much more complex situation than just making some changes to the curriculum, and that will liberate children from the implications of poverty and disadvantage. So I think you're right to be sceptical about those rather exaggerated claims that were made at the time. But I think the curriculum can make a difference. And I think some of the points about the flexibility of the curriculum, also the link between, there was an interesting report from the Institute for Government published very recently about the link between the curriculum, or the curriculum that is experienced, so that important caveat, and disengagement, disaffection from education, and also what we see at the moment, which is an attendance crisis. You can have a perfect curriculum, but if children aren't in school to experience it, then it's not going to make the difference to their lives. So the curriculum does make a difference, no question about that, but there are so many other contributors to those gaps in attainment that you can't just place all of the weight and all of the burden on the curriculum. You've got to look at those other things, but you've got to look at the links between the curriculum, the attendance crisis, behaviour in schools. All of those things are connected to each other. But yes, you can't just end poverty and disadvantage through changing the curriculum.
Okay.
I'm going to need to move us on. I'm going to move us on. I'm afraid, or we're not going to get through all of the topics that we need to cover. So I'm going to go to Mark, if that's
Thank
right.
you, Chair. I'll keep it brief. I've got one short question for Tom, 2 follow-ups for Jill. So Tom, in ASCL's submission to the curriculum review, they said that the examination system itself was partly to blame for the attainment gap. Can you tell us more about this?
Well, I think I've touched on this. So in the interest of brevity, I think it's around the forgotten third. So we have a system at the moment where if you don't achieve a grade 4 in English and maths, you are required to resit it endlessly until you might get to that grade 4 post 16. That doesn't seem like a sensible policy. We need to change that. We also know that the examination system has a particular emphasis on certain subjects linked to the accountability system. Again, that doesn't encourage all students to do what might let them thrive in later life. So I think we need to look both at the accountability measures that relate to the exam system, but also particularly that resit system.
Thank you very much. Jill, do you agree with him?
I think in terms of, I do agree in terms of things like the accountability system. I can see the thinking behind coming up with something like the EBAG measure is very much about encouraging core subjects, and we want that. But the unintended consequence is it's meant that it has narrowed the curriculum for some students. And I think, the curriculum assessment review should be looking at that, because it's not straightforward. So in arts subjects, We have seen art hold up in terms of number of entries, whereas we've seen declines in things like drama and music. And I think it's less than 50% of state schools now that enter even one student for GCSE music. And we need to make sure that we're encouraging a curriculum and accountability measures that really are playing to every individual's abilities, talents and strengths, because that's how you get engagement in the curriculum.
Absolutely. And just one final question. So you mentioned drama there. So drama, food tech, these subjects are 60% coursework, 40 to 60 hours coursework or practical work, and then 40% written exam, which is usually a 1.5 hour paper. Yeah. Is there any scope to review that balance, reduce the length of the exam, reduce the percentage that the examination contributes towards the final grade?
I think there absolutely is. I mean, if you look, you've mentioned a couple, but also if you look at vocational qualifications at 16, exams have been introduced there, and they've been introduced into qualifications at 16 as well. And this has contributed to the massive increase in exams that we're seeing. So I think there is absolutely opportunities to look at that and the balance of coursework and exam. Obviously with coursework at the moment we've got the issue of AI that we're looking at, but we have to face into that. AI isn't going to go back into its box. Students are going to be using it, and we know that NEA and coursework are really important for a lot of subjects. So I think we're going to have to sort of face into that, and really I think in the future it's going to be a case of not did you use AI, but how did you use AI in this piece of coursework. So, and it might be acceptable to use it, for example, for initial research, but not to be passing off AI generated coursework as your own work. That would be plagiarism, and we deal with it severely as we do any other forms of plagiarism.
No, that makes sense. But I take away from that we should look at that percentage split and whether that should be reviewed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Go back to Jess.
Thank you. The Secretary of State has said that building a system where more children with special educational needs and disabilities can attend mainstream schools is central. But we've heard a number of times that the current curriculum is too rigid and inflexible to meet the needs of SEND children. Is this fair, and what needs to change in curriculum and assessment to make this a reality? Darren.
I have to start. I think that's absolutely fair, and I think that's one of the tests that the Curriculum and Assessment Review is going to have to apply to whatever recommendations it sets out, because the curriculum we have now, and we can debate its strengths and its weaknesses, wasn't designed, I think, for a policy agenda and a policy context where serious consideration is being given to changing the proportion of children with special education and disabilities who are educated in mainstream settings. A really clear message from our members is that the curriculum is too rigid, it's too inflexible, and it doesn't allow for that tailoring and personalisation that you would need in order to meet the needs of many children with special educational needs and disabilities. So one of the tests that the Curriculum and Assessment Review will need to apply, and then the government will, in reviewing and reflecting on those recommendations, is the curriculum we've got fit for purpose in terms of meeting the needs of many children with SEND? And certainly the message from many of our members is that it isn't, and it would have to change. It would have to be more flexible in order to meet that test.
I'd start with I think the first point that was made is that our current curriculum actually is really good and works really well for a lot of young people, just not for all. And for a lot of those, that is SEND pupils, as Darren has outlined. I think it's also worth remembering that we haven't commented on so far, that in the bill that's currently going through Parliament, there will be a requirement to teach the national curriculum to all young people in all schools, including academies and free schools. So I think when we are looking at what the Curriculum and Assessment Review recommends, we really need to have that in mind, that every school will be required to teach that curriculum to every pupil under law. And I think that will be a really important test to think about, is that curriculum going to work for every young person?
Well, SEND as a category, of course, covers an extraordinary spectrum of needs. And it is not easy to imagine a national curriculum that could be designed of itself as a list of goals to be appropriate for each and every child in the SND category. I really think this is an area for adjuvant policy and guidance, and it's an area for really high quality CPD for teachers, and a look at the location and progression routes for the different categories of SEND young person. What's most important is early assessment, and here I'm referring to assessment as a really precise look at the challenges which a particular individual faces. I'm afraid in a system, again, as big and diverse as ours, early and appropriate assessment is not always done. And that's really bad for the child, it's really bad for the family, and often very bad for the institution and other children. But that's a very practical look at the stark realities of how it's panning out for individuals.
Yeah, I'll just focus on it from a sort of assessment point of view, because that's my expertise. I mean, we do what we can in terms of, we have a whole load of access arrangements, and the intentions of those is really to create a level playing field so that SEND students can take those assessments. But when I'm talking to parents of SEND students or to SENCOs, what's clear is a lot of what they're asking for would actually benefit not just SEND students but everyone. So some of the things they talk to me about are reducing that assessment at 16 and having a wider range of assessment types, so more coursework, having things like open book exams and formula sheets which were introduced during COVID and are still there and I think should still remain. So I think a lot of the things that would make it more accessible for SEND students would also benefit all students as well.
Darren.
Yeah. One of the comments that Jill Duffy made was that we as a country examine far more at the end of our compulsory schooling, but it's also true to say that we examine far more throughout our schooling, with SATs, with GCSEs, with A-levels, and we can compare that to other countries which are equally high in PISA tables, where in some of them there is one final exam aged 18. So I wonder, thinking about breadth and depth at primary, that leads into that, what would you consider to be the priorities for change in the curriculum and assessment at primary level? Let's go down this way in the line.
I think you're right that particularly towards the end of Key Stage 2, there does seem to be a disproportionate focus on English and mathematics. That isn't to say that they aren't foundational subjects, they're critical. And that is driven, this goes back to a theme we were exploring earlier, that is driven, I think, by the imperatives of the accountability regime. So thinking about that and looking at it might be a way of broadening and making more balanced the curriculum in the primary sector. But also, it's not just the fact that those assessments take place, it's the uses to which the outcomes of those assessments are put. So it's set within a very high stakes context. So you could, I think, plausibly run an argument that there is no problem in having a summative assessment at the end of Key Stage 2 as we do now, but it's what are you going to do with that information? And the concern about the stakes then feeds back into behaviours in schools, incentives in respect of the breadth and balance of the curriculum. So it's not just the tests themselves, it's the uses to which they're put.
Darren has made the exact point that I was going to make, so in the interest of time, Chair, I'll move on.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Darren has made the invaluable point that there is a distinction between an assessment and the uses to which the outcomes are put. In terms of the reductions which Jill has described and which members of my research team have actually advised on in terms of preserving measurement accuracy of qualifications and yet reducing the duration of the assessment, the kind of reductions we've been discussing this afternoon would bring us into line with other jurisdictions. It's up to 1/3 reduction. That's important. Secondly, I'm going to challenge the idea that we're the most assessed system in the world. We're not, and I've studied a large number of systems. America, for example, very high levels of standardised testing, and also the implications of the outcomes of those tests felt quite hard. Finland, fascinating. They do a lot of testing in primary, and they do a lot of testing of the lowest attainers. They test the low attainers because they're really worried about them. They want to understand what they're struggling with. They want to understand the misconceptions they've got. They want to understand the strengths and weaknesses so they can better support them. This is really important, to think about the purposes of assessment. The volume is not so critical, it's the purposes and what you then do with it. And if you do certain things, you can exacerbate equity, make it worse. If you do other things, you can improve it. I think that's really, really important. The other thing I just want to mention really is the huge volume of research on stress and exams, and the almost absence of research on stress and coursework. I do a lot of supervision in higher education of coursework, and it's pretty stressful. It's different sort of stress. And then when we look at the few studies that there have been, and we're trying to put that right now, the few studies that have been of 16-year-olds and 18-year-olds, where the coursework goes up in volume, when it gets beyond a certain point, the stress really kicks in. They talk about deadlines all falling at the same time, the difficulty of completing things in diverse subjects. So we've got to understand that any form of assessment, whether it's coursework or exams, comes with its own but different basket of stresses and pressures.
And just, before I go back to Darren, just push on that point a little bit. So, particularly for the very youngest children, is it absolutely necessary always for a child to know that they're being assessed in a formal and objective way, and to feel any direct pressure on them? I ask because I'm not convinced that it is necessary for children always to feel those pressures, and that we have a tension between the kind of need to gather that information and what the impact is on the social and mental well-being of children who feel themselves to be under that pressure at a very, very young age.
I think that's a great question. You can set tasks which are quite formal and allow us to make really good inferences about what a child understands, knows and can do, or issues that they're suffering in terms of language development or socialisation. You can do it in a way that so they're not aware of any stress associated with the assessment. There are many clinical tests of that kind. It's also true in the English system that there's transferred anxiety from the teachers to the children. That's a big issue, particularly in the last couple of years at primary. So we've picked that up very strongly in research in England. It's very characteristic of the system. In Finland, the teachers said, I wish we didn't have to use all these standardised tests. But actually, we know we should, because it's the way of detecting children at risk of falling behind. So it's a very, very good point you make.
Thank you. Back to Darren, sorry. Or perhaps back to Jill.
Jill, did you want to
comment? I mean, I think the point I mentioned is, and you've alluded to it, Tim, is about the purpose of assessment. And the purpose of assessment really should be about helping the individual, helping them progress, as you say, seeing where they're at. Where it becomes problematic is where it's also about school accountability measures. So we see that with the end of Key Stage 2 SATs, we also see it with GCSE. And that can lead to the pressure on students and the awareness that they're in assessments. And as you say, if teachers stress about that, gets transferred to the parents. So I think we need to be clear about what the purpose of assessment is, and really try and avoid too much assessment that's also linked to things like school accountability measures.
And a quick supplementary on this, just to underpin, we've talked a lot about assessment, but there's the kind of content as well in the curriculum. The interim report identifies a major problem with modern foreign languages teaching. I declare an interest. I'm a former university lecturer of languages. I have my own views on what's going wrong at the start, but that's not what we're here to discuss. What's your view, and we may not get to all of you because of time, but what's your view on how we tackle that major problem through curriculum change?
I mean, I think if you look at what's happened with languages over the years, even though they're part of the EBAC measure, actually they haven't increased in the way that, say, history and geography has. So I think, as always, it's a bit broader for children to say, well, why are we learning these languages? It's about their motivation as well and deciding to do it. And, one reason is we have in a world where English is very, very sort of prevalent. So they don't have that same motivation to learn a foreign language that, say, if you were in other countries, you might have in terms of learning English. So I think there's wider issues than just education, what happens in the classroom in terms of this. Tim, have you got?
Very briefly, I mean, we've got some of the best learning science going on in the acquisition of a second language, particularly in adult acquisition of second languages. And it's happening outside the traditional education research establishment. It's being done by commercial organisations. And they're really capitalising on brilliant learning science. But we don't seem to have linked that to the structure and content of school language acquisition. We're missing a trick here. But there is a lot to do with social signals of the kind that you describe. All the evidence is, if you want reasonable attainment fast, do it early, and if you can get excitement around the acquisition of a foreign language early, it is of great benefit to children more generally. Their cognitive development is enhanced. But we're bringing the attention of this gap between what we're doing in terms of commercial acquisition of the commercial provision of approaches to acquire a second language. We are bringing this to the attention of the review.
Let's skip to the next question just because Jill brought it up, and the EBAC has been mentioned. Obviously ASCL has called for the scrapping of the EBAC, and I wonder what the panel's view is on the advantages and the disadvantages of doing so. So maybe if we quickly start with Tom, and then any other comments from others within.
Thanks, Darren. I think very quickly, when you look at Progress 8 and Attainment 8, they already encourage the take-up of a majority of academic subjects. So I think it's a more nuanced performance measure. The EBAC is a binary measure. You've either done that suite of qualifications or you haven't. I think when we've called for the scrapping of the EBAC, that's been our problem. Any measure which is essentially you've either done it or you haven't is always going to be problematic, right? Where you have something like Progress 8 and therefore Attainment 8, which is more nuanced in terms of how you achieve it, that always allows for that degree of flexibility to meet the needs of different young people.
I think we would share that view about the impact of the EBAC. I think it privileges certain subjects. That's a deliberate kind of purpose that was set for it. You can see that it privileges some subjects because subjects that are excluded from it, some of the groups associated with those subjects, their objective is to get it included in the EBAC because that they see as a way of enhancing the status of the subject. So I think we need to think again about, it's a broader accountability question, but the EBAC certainly hasn't helped in terms of getting the breadth and balance that the curriculum and assessment review is tasked with exploring and making recommendations about.
I mean, I'd say just think about it as the EBAC as a particular sort of policy instrument. The national curriculum is one form, inspection is another, funding is another, professional development is another. At the time that the EBAC was created, of course, the discourse was around the need to get more kids to take sciences for the purposes of progression and the economy. Well, if we're not content with the drive from 6.8 doing triple science percent doing triple science, we've driven it to 30% by using the EBAC. I mean, maybe you shouldn't abandon the policy instrument. You should fine-tune the policy instrument. So I think it's a quite remarkable policy instrument because you can just change it, and if you do evaluation, you can fine-tune it and drive the system towards the desirable set of outcomes that you want. So I'd urge caution. It's an interesting approach, and it's what is remarkable is just how effective it's been in changing behaviour. If the behaviours aren't quite right, then think about how you can fine-tune that measure to get the outcomes and the behaviours at schools that you do want. So I'd urge caution in just saying, EBAC should be abandoned because it's done certain things in terms of subject balance. Fine-tune the subject balance by fine-tuning the measure.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is if you look at the EBAC measure at the moment, it has stalled. So it's not working as a measure anyway because it's not promoting the take-up of those subjects in schools anymore.
Charlynne.
Thank you. As a committee, we recently visited Ontario to look at schools and how they are working with pupils with special educational needs. and they had programmes for students with varying levels of need, and the focus was very heavily on the preparation for adult life, so travel training, food and nutrition, and there was a really wide range of vocational courses sort of run alongside local employers. Does the mainstream curriculum do enough here to prepare children with high levels of SEND for employability and independent living? Darren?
I think this goes back to a question we were exploring a little earlier, which is the degree to which the curriculum we have now would allow for that. And I think the perception within schools and colleges is that it wouldn't. So if that's the approach that we decide we want to see in respect of providing opportunities for pupils with SEND, bearing in mind Tim's important point that that's not a homogenous group, there's a wide range of need within that particular group, then we don't quite have the flexibility available to institutions to do something along those lines. So that's one of the reasons why I think our members are concerned that if we're going to place more of the responsibility on educating pupils with SEND in mainstream settings, we need to make sure that we have a curriculum that provides options like that, and I'm not sure we do currently.
And I think on that point, as I said earlier, we can have a really great curriculum, but there needs to be progression and qualifications for young people that are undertaking that curriculum. And we have a worry that historically we've had some qualifications, which therefore informs the curriculum, that have been seen as alternative, and they're therefore being seen as devalued. So I think as part of the test for the review, it should be, can we create a suite of qualifications which are universally valued but are accessible to all young people?
So there are a number of things. I mean, the Ontario programmes are very interesting. There's a lot of very important work going on around the world in terms of inclusivity of the kind that you describe in preparation for adult life and progression. Absolutely the case. And I think it's important to recognise that the 2010-2014 review didn't focus on those things. And it didn't focus on them for a couple of reasons. One, we were falling behind dramatically at that stage in terms of mathematics and literacy. And the international comparisons were not looking good, despite the massive investment in education that had been made. And secondly, the rationale was that the ability to construct those programs sensitively fell within something at the time was described as school autonomy. That these general goods and these preparatory programs are best determined by schools at school level. And that was associated with the curriculum freedoms around the diversification of institutional forms of schooling, which were occurring during the decade beginning in 2010. If we feel that we need national instruments to encourage and make space for and better support the provision of those local programmes, then indeed that should be in scope to the review. But it is the case that the 2010 review had a different focus, and so the existing curriculum is not finely tuned either to promote or determine the content of those kinds of programmes.
Was that not a pretty major exclusion from that process? I mean, if effectively it says that some children are more important than others in terms of national guidance.
No, it didn't argue that some children are more important than others. It was really focusing on particularly in primary, the specification of fundamentals that all children should have access to, and the importance of these in progression for all, including those that fall within the SEND population. And the provision of these kinds of programs requires a lot of sensitive curriculum development. I mean, they are brilliant programs, but they require highly sensitive local development, which is well funded. And as I say, that really...
I'm really sorry to push on that point, but
yes.
it can be argued that any area of the curriculum is hard to do, but we do it, and the government says it's important because it regards it as important.
Yeah.
Why is it different in terms of life skills?
It's a question of central specification. Now, it can certainly be the case that some governments feel that they want to take direct responsibility for the content and specification of these programmes at a level of detail. All I'm saying is that a decision in 2010-14 was taken that the decisions for the form and structure and content of those kinds of programmes would fall within the school autonomy area. And therefore the view was you opened up the opportunities for schools to design these programmes themselves. That was where that was. I'm delineating a historical position.
Can I come in very quickly?
We're really short on time, so quickly. Sorry, actually, can let Jill come in and then
I mean, as Tim said, SEND isn't a homogenous group, but it isn't true that there aren't programmes out there. We do curriculum and qualification it's called Life and Living Skills. It's national qualification, and it tends to be done post-16 at the moment. But there are programmes like that schools and colleges can look at and can work with their students on.
Coming back to something that you said, Tom, right at the beginning, that if we're going to get this right for pupils with SEND, would you agree, maybe you could give a yes or no answer, that we need to look at how schools are, what's the word? Mental blank.
Valuing.
How? Someone help me out here.
Missions?
No. How schools are sort of judged. Inspected or
held to accounts.
Yeah, because if we do, that's what sets the curriculum, and that if schools are sort of sorry, I've lost my words. Let's move on.
But yes, Karen. Yes. Inclusion should definitely be looked at as part of accountability, but we need to do that in an intelligent way, and I don't think what is being proposed at the moment is an intelligent way to do that.
One of the things we saw in Ontario was children with a really high level of need learning at quite a young age, learning really basic tasks like sorting socks and folding shirts. And one of the implications of children being taught things that are not only useful for them in life, but also that they can do, reflected on their engagement with other areas of the curriculum. So that's why I'm struggling with that. I understand that you're repeating explaining what happened in the past, but I think that's quite difficult for us when we start to think about how schools can best serve every single child and the things that motivate and engage children within education, which is why we just wanted to focus on that for a moment or two. We are running really short on time, and I just have one final question before we wrap up this panel and move to the next panel of witnesses, which is that the Becky Francis's interim report states, and I think it's part of the government's intention in commissioning the review, that the curriculum needs to adapt to reflect social and technological changes. It strikes us as a committee that will always be the case, and so I wondered whether there is any way in which such a kind of keeping pace with society and with technology can be built into the curriculum rather than requiring a comprehensive and perhaps the slightly clunky process of a comprehensive review to be undertaken every decade or so to keep pace. Jill?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are changes that can be made as the curriculum goes along. So, you've mentioned AI, and GCSE in computer science was looked at recently, prompted by Ofqual, and was updated to include AI. But that aside, I think it is really important that the curriculum and assessment review really looks at how we can keep the curriculum updated, and this is really important. 10 years is too long, really. We need mechanisms in place to make sure that we are keeping it under review. That's not only about, is it up to date, is the content up to date, it's also about, is it working? Are there parts of the curriculum that aren't working in the way that was intended? So we think mechanisms do need to put in place so that we can keep a continual sort of watch, if you like, on the curriculum.
And a lot of the teacher surveys also emphasise the extent to which teachers want periods of stability and value stability so that they can prepare really good programmes, refine them and so on. And that's important for equity and attainment. We know that from countries like Japan, stability in the national curriculum. The subjects date differently. And for example, in English literature, you might want to change text so that, as Jill says, that all segments of society see themselves in the things that they're able to study. Gravity doesn't date much. So there are areas like physics where you don't get fundamental paradigm changes, and they don't need to be reflected in any reform. Is a 10-year Big Bang done in every country? OECD shows that on average that's the tendency across systems to review their curriculum every 10 years. But actually an increasing number of countries are introducing a continual review process. But taking into account these and being sensitive to these subject differences.
I think the word mechanism that Jill used is really, really important here. We need to think about what that mechanism is. I think it's really easy to say we should review the curriculum, but what does that look like? It comes back to an earlier conversation around what the purpose of education is. We have put forward an idea about what that might look like in terms of that mechanism, and Chair, you may be relieved or quite angry to know that we've put this committee as fairly central to that mechanism of reviewing the curriculum. Thank you.
I would just say I think there's a real kind of story of our curriculum, which is, my first teaching role, I taught the first iteration of the curriculum, and the idea was that it would path the learning journey from children from 5 to 16. And I think I'm right in saying, and I'm happy to stand corrected, since the national curriculum has been introduced, no child has gone through the same curriculum from the age of 5 to the age of 16 without it being chosen. So there is an onus and there is an advantage to not having so many reviews. I think the idea of a continual review and refinement is probably worth exploring, but it is disruptive to be changing a curriculum that's supposed to be progressive and to build on prior learning when that change is due to various factors that mean that no child ever experiences it in its entirety.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming to give your evidence to us this afternoon. Can I say, if there were points that you didn't feel you had adequate time to get across to us, please do feel free to write to us after the evidence session, and we would welcome that very much. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you.
On the curriculum and assessment review, can I invite all of our witnesses to introduce yourselves to us, please, starting with Alex at this end.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alex Veitch. I'm the Director of Policy and Insights at the British Chambers of Commerce.
Hello, I'm Nick Chambers. I'm the Chief Exec of Education Employers Charity, and I apologise in advance. I had an emergency extraction of a wisdom tooth about 2 hours ago, so I'll make even less sense than normal. So, apologies.
Hi, I'm Robert West. I'm the Head of Education and Skills at the CBI, sitting in the Future of Work Directorate.
Hi there, my name's Charlynne Pullen. I'm a Principal Research Fellow at Sheffield Hallam University. Thanks.
Thank you very much. My first question is to Alex Veitch and Robert West. What do you think the UK jobs market of the future will look like in terms of offering both high-skilled and lower-skilled employment opportunities?
Start on that. Well, it won't surprise anyone if we say automation and AI are going to replace lower skilled jobs, particularly in manufacturing, particularly in routine services as well. We've got an ageing population as well, so the job market outlook as the health care sector continue to expand. High demand for medical professionals and care professionals. High skilled workers, particularly in technology and engineering fields, will be needed, and roles such as AI, cybersecurity, data analysis, they're projected to all grow rapidly as well. And the job market for both high-skilled and lower-skilled workers is going to evolve then because of technological advancements, because of demographic changes and economic shifts, and those shifts happen constantly. 5 years ago we'd be talking about COVID. Here we are talking about tariffs, and there'll be something else and something else. So we need quite an adaptable system to do that. Lower skilled workers are going to continue to find opportunities, I think, in the service sector, including retail and hospitality and customer services. But there's going to be a need for reskilling and upskilling far more than perhaps we've done in the past. If you think about our own way of just buying something, groceries in the shop, you know, we've gone away from the cash to the till, to the cash to the electric till, to the card to the till, to the self-service that we now do ourselves. So the requirement is actually having people being able to reskill and upskill, and from businesses that are members of us at the CBI, they're very much saying reskilling and upskilling, so you can respond to these changing job requirements, are really what the biggest game in town is.
Thank you. Yeah, I echo much of that. Clearly a rapid transformation in the skills landscape. It's not all about the technical capability and human skills, communication, adaptability, problem solving. I'm sure we'll get into this, but the core skills that people need to learn on the job will always be important. Lower skilled roles, there is a risk of reducing number of roles due to automation, AI, increased tech. I think 'twas ever thus to some extent though. High skilled roles, there'll be demand for technical expertise, digital competence, and what we call cognitive flexibility, if you like, the ability to think around different topics. I just wanted to draw the committee's attention to a couple of things that actually we didn't mention in our response, which I just thought were really interesting. So we did some work about skills of the future for a partner last year, and we took a sample of about 1,200 businesses, and we said, over the next 5 years, what single skill set or job role would help the most to increase your productivity? So focus on productivity. And we had, of those that gave us an option, a specific option, and that was about 60% of them, it fell into 3 buckets, which actually surprised me when I read them. 3 buckets. One is management and leadership. One is technical and digital skills. And one is sales and customer engagement. And so what we can draw from that is it's not all about the tech. And I'm sure we'll come back to this. The whole theme about management and leadership is really important to productivity and growth in this country, and something that should be protected in skills policy. I think is borne out by the evidence that we have. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Charlynne.
Thank you. The National Foundation for Education Research has said that the essential employment skills of the future are not specialist skills, but social and cognitive skills such as communication, collaboration, problem solving and creativity. Do you think that these skills are adequately taken account of in the current national curriculum, and are they being adequately considered by the review? And I'll start with Charlynne.
Yeah, so we did some work on generic skills within the 14 to 19 curriculum across 10 jurisdictions, so including England and actually Ontario as well. And England is an outlier in that group. They're an outlier because we don't include specifically generic skills or competencies, transversal skills within our national curriculum. The only place that they are very specifically referenced are study programmes for 16 to 19-year-olds on vocational courses. So colleges have to provide a kind of non-qualification based enrichment support as part of their study programme, along with vocational qualifications and English and maths resits if required. So in terms of setting it down within the curriculum, no, England is an outlier internationally. The vast majority, I mean the other 9 jurisdictions that we looked at all provided for some form of generic skills within the curriculum. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was assessed. It doesn't necessarily mean there were specific teachers. In fact, it was only in Ontario that there were specific teachers of generic skills. One of the key kind of freedoms, if you like, was teachers being able to interpret those generic skills themselves in terms of how they would teach different subjects. We talked earlier about skills within disciplines, and it was the teachers who were able to do that internationally. That was our findings. Thanks.
Did anyone else want to come in on that?
Well, I think it's true that transferable skills, I think as we called it in the written evidence to this, is very much on the agenda of a lot of our members. So as Alex was talking about there, those communication and problem solving skills were there. I think the honest answer is that the employers certainly we work with don't see it in terms of what's coming out from the other side, whether it's there or not. The perception is very strong. 5 years ago, on our annual survey of members, we asked our members how many thought young people were work ready when they left education, and 44% said they weren't. On our same annual survey this year, 44% said that they weren't. So nothing really has changed in terms of at least the perception of whether people are picking up the skills that they regard as being important. And it is, taking into account what I said earlier about that changing landscape, those need for being adaptable and having a range of skills like problem solving, like critical thinking, or at least highlighting those within the curriculum where they exist, is something that we're hearing there's a big demand for.
You mentioned critical thinking, and I was really interested in the recommendation of the Commission into countering online conspiracies in schools, which is a really interesting commission, which has said that it's really important we embed critical thinking across the curriculum. I just wondered to what extent critical thinking is important from an employer perspective. Robert, Nick, or Alex?
I'm not really an employer, so I'm going to hand that over to Alex.
Yeah, I mean, like I briefly touched on before, I think it comes through our surveys as something that's really important, because then you can turn people onto different tasks regardless necessarily of having the quote unquote right qualifications. So again, it's going back to the evidence we had from the specific survey about productivity. It was technical and digital skills in the round, but that included data analysis as something that came up, which can be linked to critical thinking. So I think more broadly, just on the other end of the spectrum, there was a really interesting project. You might have come across it, called Kickstart. It's a DWP project that the chambers were involved in linking up Job Centre Plus with employers, and so this is primarily people going through DWP, hence. Neat young people or perhaps a little bit older. So the whole work ready thing came up really strongly there, and the programme had, I think, quite mixed reviews. I think there were challenges on the employer side and on the job centre side, but I wanted to say on this hearing, I'd really encourage the committee to see if you can find some evaluation evidence about that to inform your work, because even though it's DWP, of the various practical measures that I've seen of taking people that are excluded from education and training and placing them in jobs, that is a very concrete example. And there is an evaluation, but I think you might be able to find out a bit more in depth about what really happened, and we've got some information about it too.
I think a modern curriculum would embrace those things like critical thinking really and focus on practical skills like financial literacy, project management, problem solving, things that are directly applicable within the workplace, and also in terms of addressing a decline in students taking creative subjects like design and technology or music and art, that well-rounded skill set. Again, bearing in mind the fact that jobs are changing faster, they will continue to change. There's still a bit of a myth in terms of careers where I see careers advisors advising people about which career they want to do. Well, we all know here actually we don't have a career now, we have a series of careers. So a modern curriculum would prepare people for the fact that throughout your working life you will have a number of different roles. So what are the practical skills that will enable you to move across and work in various industries and work for various businesses?
Thank you. So my question is also to Alex and Robert. So according to research comparing England against other OECD countries, it shows that England's 15 to 16-year-olds have below average levels of socio-emotional skills, so things like cooperation, emotional control and persistence. And the greatest inequality amongst English 15 to 16-year-olds in these skills across the age group compared to other countries. How do you think employers respond or would respond to this finding?
Well, I could kick off with a few thoughts on that. Thank you very much for the question. What we hear back from employers is many feel that the current secondary framework is too focused on working towards academic qualifications rather than, or perhaps to the detriment of building other skills needed to be competent in life. I was very interested hearing the first panel talk about this actually, and what is the purpose of education, those fundamental questions, which is for the specialists, not for me. But that it comes up all the time when we speak to employers. So the problem statement is definitely there. So what could we do about it? From our perspective, could the curriculum, could there be more opportunities for applied learning through the curriculum or through the practical implementation of the curriculum, the interpretation of the curriculum by learning providers, by teachers? And also we think it's fundamental to actually promote vocational qualifications and have what we call a parity of esteem between them. And I think that that vocational, real-life, practical, applied knowledge would be good for young people who are that way inclined and brilliant for employers as well.
Thank you. Robert?
I think the answer is they wouldn't be surprised. I think that's the experience we hear back, that actually that young people are lacking in those particular areas. I think what can you do about it? Well, it's about ensuring that there are flexible learning pathways. We still have a system that kind of works as much on what people can't do as well as what they can do. So that shift in emphasis of saying, actually, these are the skills that somebody has got, albeit to different levels. This is what somebody can do, albeit that to different levels, is good. We heard in the earlier session about that feeling that curriculum is too rigid. So that ability of flexible learning, flexible ways of teaching as well. Not everything needs to be taught or assessed even in the same way. It doesn't all need to have an exam. It doesn't all need to be a certain length of time. It can be in shorter, bite-sized learning. Again, to have, which I think is really what we've been calling for, this modern education system requires that variety of approaches. You were talking earlier about modern foreign languages, A lot of people learn those in bite-sized people. We all have our Duolingos and ideas now. So looking at the world as it is and the way that people learn now, as opposed to try and get them to fit into a system that actually has probably had its day, is really where it's got. So in terms of how do you get people to be in that way, you make it a more inclusive and flexible system.
Thank you.
Can I just add a point around the variation, if that's okay? So one of the speakers before talked about the between school variation, and one of the challenges, of course, is that if we don't write in some form of generic skills or kind of support in terms of communication, collaboration, etc., into the curriculum, then schools have the freedom to do essentially whatever whatever they feel is best for their learners. And so you end up with variation where the best schools are providing these things and the worst schools, or the schools that have the most challenges and the greatest need and maybe kind of less finances and different challenges, end up not providing those generic skills, and a way of ensuring that everyone is getting that same provision is to ensure that it is part of a national curriculum framework that everyone has to follow, and that's what happens elsewhere in other countries.
Thank you. So this question is to Charlynne. What lessons can the curriculum review apply from Sheffield University's International Review of Generic Skills in the 14 to 19 curriculum?
So, I mean,
I'm sure
as I
you could say a lot on this.
One of the things is about that school variation, and I think one of the other the kind of lessons from some of the things that we looked at internationally. Obviously, you don't want to end up in a kind of situation of policy borrowing. We need to kind of create a policy and a curriculum which fits culturally. But one of the key issues really is about the professionalism and the status of teachers. So in most of these countries, generic skills is part of a national curriculum framework, but then teachers are enabled and provided with appropriate CPD, with the appropriate freedom, with the high levels of qualification to interpret that for their learners and for their subjects. So although you're saying you have to teach generic skills within the curriculum, you're not mandating exactly how that works, you're not prescribing exactly what that looks like, and there isn't necessarily an assessment. There is often some kind of project-based learning, and that's encouraged, but it's the teachers are provided with the autonomy to make some of those decisions. And the situation in England, because of the level of freedom that schools have, is that freedom or autonomy often sits at school level, with teachers then having to teach things in a particular way, particularly certain multi-academy trusts if you're in a very kind of prescriptive one that says you have to do everything in a particular way. So one of the key lessons was about those different levels and the mechanisms that enable generic skills to be well taught within the curriculum by well-qualified, high-status teachers.
Thank you. The review comments that many students are likely to be receiving informal support for generic skills because of the freedom for academies to depart from the national curriculum, as you said. So will the removal of that freedom through the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill make that more difficult in your view?
I mean, I think, as I say, if it's written into a national curriculum that there needs to be some provision of generic skills, and then every school needs to follow the national curriculum, then it provides an assurance that all schools have a responsibility to provide this. So it reduces the variability. That's the intention. Or I imagine that would be the intention. As I said, because we looked at 14 to 19, actually colleges are doing this already. Study programmes has a specific non-qualification aspect. There was a report on enrichment done by the Association of Colleges, NCFE and the University of Derby, that highlighted the value and the support for kind of enrichment within colleges, but also highlighted that they would like a bit more guidance on what that looks like. So to kind of bear that in mind, it's possible that not putting generic skills in the curriculum just in general, without necessarily providing that guidance, might still not reduce the variability.
Okay, thank you.
Jess. Yes, we've already covered this a little, but we know that some commentators have suggested the focus on the high level of knowledge in the curriculum has crowded out skills. What have the effects of the knowledge-rich or content-heavy approach been over the last 15 years from employers' perspectives? And can I come to Alex first?
Yeah, so it was interesting, again, listening to the debate last time about knowledge versus skills. I think hopefully this will be an okay answer because it's not a direct answer, but what employers say is that they're very confused about level 3 qualifications. So I don't know to what extent this kind of spread of different types of level 3 quals has been caused by the knowledge-rich approach or not. But if we were looking for a problem to solve, that would be the issue. It's not that the qualifications themselves lack merit. It's just that there is a confusing landscape. There's a kind of discovery process that businesses have to go through to figure out what quals are out there, what's funded and what's not. Now, it's not for us to say which ones are right or wrong. I think one thing that didn't help with the previous government, though, was suddenly announcing defunding of some of them. And FE College is very often in chamber membership, and we heard this, believe you me, we heard this loud and clear. So I suppose we might have a situation where we have a very academic route, schools and sixth forms, and then we have a vocational route, which is, the vocational route could come across to employers, I think, as quite confusing, hard to engage with, and the apprenticeship system then sort of becomes the implementation of that, which is also viewed, I think, unfairly sometimes as very complicated as well. So, you know, I guess I can see the outcome of education policy as being this really increasingly almost divergent two tracks of much more academic, much less academic, vocational, but the vocational bit's just not working very well. So I suppose question is that because of this conscious policy choice at the time. It's not really for me to say, but it's something that we'd love to see brought back together and fixed, and with much less of a sort of two-tier perception about one being better than the other. So I hope that's an okay answer, but that's the way we see it.
Yeah. I'm quite interested because I think you mentioned that we need to see sort of more options for children who may not want to go into that very academic sphere. Should we be bringing more vocational education much earlier into, you know, GCSE levels, or perhaps even earlier than that? I don't know, Robert, if you've got a view on that.
Yeah, I would say yes, earlier than that is probably the answer. When we talk to our members about skills, we tend to identify there are three buckets they tend to fall into. One is that they have current skills needs. I need someone with these skills now, haven't got necessarily time to train them. You've got your emerging skills needs, which are, I don't need this today, but I'll probably need it tomorrow, so we're changing our fleet to electric vehicles, so we need someone who can do that. And then you've got your future skills needs, which, as it was described to me by one member, I don't know what quantum's going to do to our business, but it will do something at some point. And that's the interesting bit, because can you try and look at those things like quantum and trace them back through the education system? So at the earliest points, people are being made ready for when they leave the education system to be able to contribute. So the example I often give with this is in Estonia, the majority of primary school children study robotics. Now, what was it that meant in Estonia that they have that commitment to robotics and programming at the earliest age? Was driven by a vision to be future ready, isn't it? To be innovative, to look ahead at those. So I think, yes, the vocational at the earliest stage, it is important. Very often the vocational aspects get picked up at the end, and we still have this situation where vocational and technical is regarded for the people who didn't do well academically, and that we've got to get rid of.
Well,
my question is for Nick. So skills for adult life and employability are particularly important for those children with special educational needs. Do you work in a specialised way with these children?
No, I mean, we work, our sort of focus is around role models for young people, and I think in the SEND context, actually seeing people doing jobs is really, really important, and that applies across the piece. You know, the whole thing is you can't be what you can't see. So ours is giving those children, which, you know, we've not done enough for them, is to show them the pathways open to them. And it's something that comes out, sorry, I'm not speaking very well with my tooth, it comes out very strongly in the interim review that actually, you know, we're not good at, you know, providing pathways. You've touched on it. You know, I think we've got a, you know, whichever way we look at it, we've got nearly 1 million young people currently unemployed. We've got employers desperate to find people. So there is something sort of fundamentally wrong. I don't think it's curriculum. And I think so far what I've seen in interim review is a really good piece of work. It's well grounded. It's not surprisingly. It's really evidence-based. But I think, you know, you could have the most perfect curriculum in the world, but unless kids can see the meaning and relevance and the pathways to them, you're going to end up with kids going down certain routes, and that whether it applies to, you know, the vocational, the starting early, it's about understanding pathways for young people.
And to Alex and Robert, do you focus on the abilities of this group and guiding employers on supported and inclusive employment? Alex?
Yeah, I think we find that employers want inclusive workplaces, and we're talking about SEND in that regard now, but often lack the tools and support to make that a reality. And I think that gets more challenging the smaller the business is. So we would like to see better guidance, more flexible pathways, as Nick said. A general theme for us is more comprehensive partnerships between the different players, so between employers and schools and education providers, specialist education providers. There's been a really strong example of this called local skills improvement plans that you might have come across before, where it's very simple. You link education providers and employers in a place and you get them to talk to each other. And like Robert was saying, get your skills plan for the employers and match that against what colleges and schools are doing. And that flow of interaction and planning could work just as well for SEND as it does for other people, because if you don't talk to each other, if you don't see, you can't be, you'll never make it happen. So we think that could happen. I also personally think there's really good pockets of good practice in this space. I'll just pick one, which is Network Rail. I've worked in the railways for a long time, and they have a very strong apprenticeship and recruitment drive for neurodiverse people, young people, and less young people. I feel myself that there are pockets of good practice and a lack of sort of comprehensive guidance, which I think could help. But it's a very difficult situation.
So we've talked about inclusive and flexible learning pathways and how they're done. I don't know a business that doesn't want lots of people clamouring for the jobs that they offer. So the idea of being more inclusive to enable people, and we heard at the earlier session, what a large group SEND is and what that covers, but social disadvantages as well. We need as many people as possible being work ready and being able to take up those opportunities. And as Nick says, he's quite right. That experience of work. I think work experience is very, very important within this. The importance of integrating work experience into the system as well. But also recognising the increasing pressure that's being put on businesses now by work experience. So we've got the 2 weeks worth of work experience coming in at a time when there are T-level placements being asked for, and apprenticeships and graduate schemes that businesses are simply, particularly at the smaller level, are under-resourced to deliver. The answer to that is to get some genuine employer collaboration, employer engagement in there. I think businesses and employers tend to be engaged a bit like a tick list. I talk to our group, tick, I've done that. But actually, how do you get businesses to provide real-world insights and opportunities in a way where they can see the return on investment? And I don't mean financial, I just mean in terms of having skilled future employees lining up. That's the rationale for it. So involve businesses earlier in helping to inform what goes on within a school, within a college.
Thank you. I want to now focus on the grade 4 in GCSEs, Maths and English. Is that focus, is that a gateway to employment? How useful is that to employers, the focus on achieving grade 4 in Maths and English at GCSEs level?
I would say at all qualifications level, they lose their currency over time. Often qualifications are a stepping stone to something else. Your GCSE will get you where you're going with your A-levels or T-levels or vocationals, which will then get you either into higher education, further education, or, as Nick has said, not. You kind of drop off the list as well. So it has a value. The point is, what is it useful for businesses to know? I think particularly in terms of GCSE, what's important is the literacy and numeracy, not necessarily the qualification at that level. And again, to what degree can somebody do this, not whether they failed it or passed that particular level. The thing I'd add into this as well is also to do with digital skills as well. So we've talked about the rise of digital technologies. ICT for a little while was up there with English and maths and has now kind of faded back down again as well. But there's a strong need for students to develop digital literacy and technical skills as much as there is literacy in terms of English and maths as well. So I would say it is of some use. I think over time you need to realise this will lose its currency. So what is it that people need to know at what particular stage? What's the value of the qualifications? I certainly think in later life, and we see this with apprenticeships, don't we, where people who have been doing a job for 30 years were being cut off from doing apprenticeships because they didn't have the GCSE maths that they haven't required for 30 years of doing this job in order to do the apprenticeship, So that's what I mean by it kind of leaves currency. If GCSE, English and maths is relevant and has currency, then good, but I don't think it should be the be-all and end-all of whether somebody moves on or not.
Yeah, just to come in as well, so my personal practical experience in apprenticeship delivery was I was part of a group leading the apprenticeship standard for level 3 HGV driving, so before this role, and all through the gateway process, corralling the employers to agree what's a truck driver do. It took about 2 years. It was very hard, and not necessarily the fault of IFATE. It was the employers trying to agree with each other as well. And then the implementation of that, I did lots of webinars with learning providers about how you use it effectively. So the reason I'm saying that is that I know that, and our evidence in my job now in the chambers backs this up, that not having that grade 4 pass at GCSE is a barrier to people taking up apprenticeships, as Robert said, and that can be at jobs like driving an HGV, which is one I've got experience of helping people through it. However, it is so important in any job role to have functional competency in English and maths. Right, so I think I'd slightly resist the temptation to say this doesn't matter, but it's also true that it is a barrier. And so I hope this is right, but my understanding is there is now flexibility for employers to decide whether to apply the level 2 standard requirement for the apprenticeships.
Only for adults.
Yeah. Which actually is my experience of doing this. It's for adults rather than young people. So fair play. But I suppose the question would be, is this really okay that we don't have any requirement on people doing apprenticeships doing it? I think that employers will really have to think long and hard what else could they do if they need to have some requirement for English and maths, reading competencies, maths, you must need that. But we're quite happy with that settlement for adults, so thank you for clarifying that for me. There must be a way through it for the education professionals to figure out how we can get over this hump. I heard the first panel talking about endless resits being difficult, and we agree with that, but at the same time, is there a different way of assessing it? Is there a way through it that still gets people through a decent level of competencies for future life? So that's not really our position, but it's just an observation that feels like I wouldn't want to sit here and say it doesn't matter, we can just drive through it, because I don't think employers really think that's right. I think there has to be some level of competence on it. I don't know if others on the panel agree with that.
Anyone else wants to come in? Or?
Just on the provision for English and maths teaching, we've done a couple of CPD evaluations of teachers who are having to deliver the English and maths to 16 to 18-year-olds. And as Tim mentioned in the previous session, one of the challenges is that learners miss something at primary school, and the cumulative, particularly in maths, the cumulative kind of work throughout secondary school means that, but actually, through some excellent CPD, they've been able to kind of find many different ways of explaining the same concepts to learners, and those things are of real benefit. So there is, although it is very difficult, and it is of course demotivating to continue to sit an exam when you're hopefully progressing but not necessarily getting the right grade, it is true that there is increasing quality in the teaching of English and maths for 16 to 18-year-olds, and it is a different kind of teaching than they get at school, and one which is able to more appropriately meet their needs. So.
And we know that a third of students do not achieve a grade 4 in English and maths by the age of 16. So would employers respond, how would employers respond to the development of a lower qualification in literacy and numeracy for everyday life? A little bit what you were suggesting.
Yeah, well, I was just talking. I was really looking at how do you offer some kind of certificate of attainment of where somebody is at, as opposed to you have passed or failed this particular aspect. So, what an employer wants to know is where is this person at? What can this person do? What can't this person do? That's the statement that you're looking for. Now, depending on what the job is, that will be different at different times. But we all know people that have qualifications that aren't necessarily able to do the job because it's not based on the piece of paper, is it? That's where we go into this broader area of character development and essential skills and that kind of practical knowledge as well being just as important. But I think if you just came up with another qualification, as I think Alex was saying earlier, adding to a confusing landscape is just something just to be treated with a little bit of caution.
Yeah, instinctively, another qualification is adding to a kind of scroll of list of qualifications already. So, not against it. It's just can we perhaps it might be a starting point to think about all the ones that are already there and which ones should be retained and which ones should be streamlined.
And we touch upon artificial intelligence and automation and its impact on jobs, often on entry-level jobs. What priority should be given to digital skills and artificial intelligence in the curriculum review? And maybe should we start with Nick?
I was looking at the OECD's data on ICT, which I suppose is an AI and digital, and the aspirations of young people have not really changed over 20 years. So it's quite interesting that despite us all talking about this, actually the thing is flat-levelled. It's gone up slightly for boys, but for girls, because they can't relate to it, they can't understand the roles in it. And I think unless you can see it, you can't believe it. So I think on the ICT, lots of fantastic jobs. We've just done a report for the Northern Ireland government of kids' aspirations, where the jobs are, and hardly anybody is interested in AI, cyber, ICT at all. And that's where the growth is. They want to be footballers, influencers, teachers. They do, and I think there's a serious point to this, because they can't see the relevance. So, I think something needs to change to actually show them those. We can talk about it all the time, but unless we get out your question earlier, Chair, about keeping pace. You asked earlier about keeping pace, and the only way really for schools to keep pace is to enable their young people to see people who do those jobs in person, because how can any career system keep up with things changing so quickly?
So Nick's absolutely right again about this thing of employer engagement and work experience is crucial at the heart of it. But if you're going to have a modern curriculum and a modern education system, then digital has got to be at the heart of that, hasn't it? Whether it's AI and digital technologies, so it's crucial to develop those digital literacy and technical skills. But despite high demand and whatever's done within the school life of somebody or college life of somebody, what we do know is that continuous learning and upskilling is important. So this needs to tie into some way with developing the culture of lifelong learning, which is something we still, again, have a system that kind of says that once you've been educated up to the age of 21, well, that's that then, and you go off. We need to start blurring the lines much more and trying to get a culture of you are where you are, you develop where you develop, and that continuous culture of lifelong learning is something that needs to be developed. But enhanced digital skills, I think, has got to be at the heart, because that's the world that we live in now.
Yeah. Just to say, in terms of kind of ICT related generic skills, of the 10 jurisdictions that we looked at, 5 mentioned it very specifically, and it is part of the computing curriculum, which I understand in the 14 to 16 phase is a kind of foundational subject which should be delivered but isn't necessarily assessed, and that includes developing and applying analytical problem-solving, design and computational thinking skills. So I think there are ways that that could be interpreted to include AI. I think there's a kind of focus around critical skills as well within really all of the kind of interests around generic skills, which would relate to how digital skills might be applied more generally.
I think all I'd add to that, I agree with all that. What we hear from employers is that they have some people entering the workforce with very limited skills, digital skills, ability to use fairly basic forms of tech like Microsoft Office, to those who have a more advanced level of digital capability but perhaps don't know how to apply that in the workplace, so aren't familiar with cybersecurity protocols and so on. We also we're tracking SME uptake of quote unquote AI, or people using AI. It went from a third to a half are using AI in some way, they think, over a year. But you know, the way that AI is being rolled out is not quite what's said in the media. So in any workplace now, really, all of the mainstream applications you see will have AI built into them. If they don't already, they will have. So Microsoft Office has Copilot, for example. Others are available. And you can choose to buy the license to use it or not. And other applications integrate AI without an extra fee. There's a lot of talk about AI, quote unquote, as a separate entity. What may happen instead is the kind of tech that we use stays the same. The names of the software stays more or less the same, with the exception of people using ChatGPT in a functional way for their business, but it's just got better and quicker and more productive. So that's the kind of way we see it. I don't know how many jobs there will be in actually building large language models. That's probably the sort of people who are doing computer science anyway that we get into that side. So we have a little bit more of a real world perspective, and the need for quality digital skills in computer science at school is still the same as it has been for the last 20 years. We need more of it.
And again, we probably need to look at how things like AI are being used in skills, in things like assessments as well. Are there opportunities in how you do assessments to use AI that begins to go into Nick's area of seeing people use it? If the school aren't using it as part of their daily way of operating, again, why would a young person at that school know? Because they haven't seen that particular way. So again, are we being a modern enough education system, embracing the technologies as well, that then provide the models for young people to say, oh, there's a particular role and job now that didn't exist when that teacher was at school.
I mean, there's a point made in the interim review, isn't it, about more applied knowledge, and I think that's a really important bit of that actually showing people the relevance. I was with a group of civil servants in Birmingham, Aston, in fact, in a primary school last Thursday, and we had them talking to the children, because I think starting early in primary is really important. And we had a lady who worked for the Department of Transport, and she used AI to do with traffic lights and how to cross the road. I mean, the kids were just amazed. But it's about simple things, but actually opening up those children's horizons. Whether you go on the whole breaking down barriers, opportunities for all. We do need to do more to show kids the opportunities open to them. And you can have the best curriculum in the world, but unless those kids can see the opportunities of the curriculum, we're not going to make the progress we need to.
Jess. Yes, this is to Nick. Research by your organisation suggests that young people's career aspirations at age 17 to 18 are similar to the aspirations of children aged 7 to 8. Are schools doing enough at primary school age to expose children to types of employment and challenge stereotypes?
Good, I better get this right because it's our own research. All our research, in fact we're doing work for the Canadian government at the moment on this, all of our research around kids' aspirations is heavily based on their parents, their carers, where they live, who they know, and increasing social mobility. And you're quite right, the aspirations of 7-year-olds are very similar to 17-year-olds. On the 20th of May this year, the OECD are going to publish their largest ever study of the career aspirations of 14 to 16-year-olds in 80 countries. And that's something I hope this committee will look at, because it's got the biggest data set of what kids are aspiring to. Could you just repeat your question? Sorry, my tooth sort of picked it out.
No worries at all.
I lost my thought for a second.
So I was just asking whether we should be doing more in primary school to expose children to different types of employment and to challenge stereotypes. And I just wondered whether you'd seen any good programmes that really did help to maybe perhaps in some cases kind of tear children away from parents, carers and locality and actually decide to take a different track.
Well, the risk of being self-promotional, which I was trying to avoid. I mean, the primary futures in Inspiring the Future, which was set up by the NHT and supported actually by the CBI and Chambers. I mean, that's now got about 40% of primary schools getting people into schools, role models. And in fact, actually, that's what's being replicated in Canada. So we've got some great examples here that is now being replicated in other parts. So, I mean, I would like to see that every young person in this country, wherever they live, gets a chance to meet role models, starting at primary, and just seeing the variety. I mean, even around the room here, just seeing the variety. And now with virtual, I mean, we can be seen anywhere, but there's nothing stopping anyone connecting anyone anywhere. So wherever you live, if you live in a really coastal area, in a little place like Galston or somewhere like that, you'll see the people around you. If you live in, Kensington, you see a completely different set of people. But there's nothing wrong with connecting the two. And virtual, which we've done a lot of, enables that. But I'd like to see every young person given an opportunity.
We'll just go finally to Darren.
Yes. Is that disconnect between the aspirations that 17 and 18-year-olds have and then the likely jobs which are available to them the same across all groups, do you know, or do they differ by sex, by ethnicity, socioeconomic status?
Socioeconomic, I mean, the data is coming out in the 20s. I have actually seen the reports, I better not say too much about it. But there is no doubt that the social-economic factors are one of the biggest determinants. So social economic background is probably one of the biggest determinants of your academic success still. Huge variations on social economic roles. And I think it's about aspiration, isn't it, really? Gender, still some very strong gender issues. We just done some work in Sweden where the top job in primary that kids aspire to for women was a hairdresser. Very surprised by that. Followed by teacher, which is normally, but yeah. So across the OECD data, if you look globally, there are still very strong differences on gender, and that's nearly in every country. Even the ones we talk about doing brilliantly well on gender equality, they still got, you take place like Iceland as recently, still real problems of actually finding enough girls to study science. Real problems. Same in Finland, same in Estonia. So, the problems we're trying to tackle here are global issues. But yeah, so gender, ethnicity, but more of a complex answer to that, and social economic background, hugely impactful.
Can I just add on aspirations? So some of the evidence using cohort studies suggests that misaligned aspirations are the most kind of damaging, if you like. So if you have you could have kind of relatively low aspirations but actually very high attainment at school, and then you meet those low aspirations. But similarly, you could have very high aspirations but actually low attainment at school and no real understanding of how to get from where you are to where you want to be. And those are the real challenges, having the kind of appropriate, for want of a better phrase, kind of aspirations that match your kind of level of attainment or level of interest or potential attainment is really important. I did some work using a cohort study looking particularly at learners who don't go to university and their aspirations, and they are at 13, 14, and then the kind of outcomes at 25. And one of the key things there is that those young people aged 13, 14 who don't end up going on to university are much more likely to want to be self-employed than those that do go to university. And actually by 25 they are much more likely to be self-employed than the young people that go to university. So something about validating a series of different aspirations at school, so that it isn't just about saying everyone should follow a particular path, and enabling people to have different levels of aspiration and those being equally successful is kind of critical, really.
And do you know how much that kind of research on the misaligned aspirations is feeding into how our careers advisors work? And obviously a point here is on the curriculum and assessment review, because I've long said, if we tailored maths more towards here's the kind of maths you're going to need for running a small business, running your own business, rather than just being the next mathematician Nobel Prize winner, actually we could make it more useful. But is that research feeding in? Do you know? Because that sounds vital.
Yeah, I don't know specifically. What I would say is that things like the Gatsby benchmarks make different kind of careers and different pathways. They should make them more available and more understood by young people, so that they can make those jumps. How do you, just because you have low attainment at 14 doesn't mean you will always have low attainment, and doesn't mean you can't meet those high aspirations. It just means you need a different pathway to get there. And what I would hope, I suppose, is that the careers advice is able to personalise that kind of advice to enable people to get to a particular pathway, regardless of how long it takes. And some of the points that have been made around upskilling and reskilling suggest that this isn't necessarily, although we have quite a high stakes system at the moment, particularly in academic education, if we believe in lifelong learning, it isn't necessarily a hard stop at 18, I would suggest.
I think improved career guidance is a really key outcome that we want to get, because you need to ensure those clear lines of sight as well. Because again, building on what Nick was saying, you see what you see, and of course in relation to jobs, there are somewhere jobs and everywhere jobs, aren't there? If you live in a particular area that's a fishing port, there are certain jobs that you would see that you wouldn't necessarily see in Birmingham. There are other things that are digital as well. So taking in that context of this is where we are, this is where we live, therefore this is what's aspirational, and then trying to build in that guidance, it becomes a much more proactive thing. That again, it's another thing I think we're behind the curve on in terms of careers guidance, really. The careers advice I think young people get is basically what they would have got in the last century, and probably quite a way back in that last century as well.
You're absolutely right on that misalignment. It's what's talked about on page 2 of the report about young people and parents not understanding the pathways open to them. We did a report with the CBI back with your predecessor in 2013 for ministers about improving careers advice. And one thing is it said we need to make the National Careers Service much more approachable, much more for young people, and direct money. 2 years ago I was invited to another select committee, surprisingly I've been invited back, but I said, the litmus test, if you're a constituency and you're a young person and you want to find about jobs in the green sector, go online and Google it. So I did it 2 years ago, and I went to the National Careers Service and I Googled careers in green. The top job is a Royal Marine. Why? Green Beret. And I did it yesterday and I got exactly the same answer. Right? So since we published this report 2013, we've had an entire group of people who've started primary school who are about to finish, and we still, in my view, are not much further on. So I do think, part of it is getting people in, and that's why, organisations are going to be brilliant, but we need to do lots more, particularly to counter all the sort of social media as well. We need much more investment generally on showing kids what's possible than we have at the moment.
Now, a point we made as part of that work, in 2014 we were at the Education Committee there, and we said that transfer of responsibility of careers guidance to schools would lead up to a different provision and quality of careers advice around there, and I think that's been shown to be the case. We've got a bit of a postcode lottery going on in terms of careers we probably have in terms of curriculum.
Do you see any discrepancy between private schools and state schools in terms of what they're exposed to, speech days, visitors, people coming to, or is that evening out now? Because I know there's been a lot of work done in the state sector about bringing more people into school to talk about careers.
I mean, it's about social capital, isn't it? I mean, it's huge. I mean, I was a design and technology teacher in a state school up in Lancashire, and I moved to St Paul's School in London, and the disparity then was massive, and it still is, because it's about the people they know, the connections, the ability to find work experience. So has the divide changed? I mean, it's got slightly better, you know, with some of the programmes like Inspiring Future and Speakers for Schools. Things have improved, but actually we need to go a lot further than we have done. You know, if you go to St Paul's, they'll have a whole room of dedicated, you know, advice on different careers, different networks, tutors. If you want to go to American University, they've got someone who can help you, you know. And I think if you're not average, that's the wrong word, you know, a lot of state schools just need a bit of help and need a support. They don't want to keep being told they're not doing well enough, because most of them are doing brilliantly. But they need help, and they need easy access to people, and to give the same access that some of those independent schools have by right.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our evidence session for today. Can I say the same to you as I did to the previous panel, which is that if there were points that you didn't feel you had time to get across to us adequately in the session this afternoon, because we have been quite time constrained, please do write to us after the session, and we'd welcome that very much. But it's been very interesting to hear from all of you today, so thank you very much. Order, that brings our public proceedings to a close.